right, listen up.
Well, welcome everybody once again to the 440th VFW podcast. It's summer. Vacations and whatnot have meant that we haven't recorded quite as frequently as we would like to, but we are here. We're still flying. We're still having a good time, and we thought, hey, we should get in one of these podcasts recorded. So I am back once again, and with me once again is Zeus. How you doing tonight, Zeus?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
I'm very well, actually. It's always fun to do these. We don't talk.
You're right. It has been a while.
It has been a little while, but that's, normal. Like we say, we've said many times in private conversations that summer's a little bit slower, although it's been awesome to see that we've still been having flights and still been having, pretty good turnout.
We've had some great turnout the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, we've had some fun missions. So tonight I thought that we could sort of continue. I have this sort of vague story arc in mind. I mean, we'll divert from it, I'm sure, but, we sort of started out with, hey, we're a VFW, what does that mean? And we moved through and talked about, how one might, join, so forth and so on. Last time we talked about briefing, a little bit before the mission, how we prep. And then I was thinking we should talk about debriefing, but I realized that there's actually this very, very important bit in between the briefing and the debriefing, which is where we fly. And,
little details.
Minor details, right? The whole, kind of point of what we're doing, right? The part that we all super enjoy. And so I thought, hey, well, we should do 40 or 50 or 100 episodes on that part, but, let's do one.
Start with the first one.
Exactly. And so I thought, well, what can we talk about? And you and I flew a mission, I think it was a few days ago, Sunday. Not that it matters. People are listening to this, who knows when, but it was a few days ago. I don't know why, but it just sort of struck me as I was flying. I'm like, man, there's a lot to talk about with respect to sensor management. And what I mean by that is using the instruments available to you, including your eyeballs, to kind of understand what the situation around you is, to build up your situational awareness. And we happened to fly that last mission together, you and I, as wingies, and I thought, oh, great, we'll talk to Zeus about how he does things, and I can maybe lend my perspective. But I don't know, what do you think? Does that sound like a reasonable thing that people might be interested in hearing about?
I think so. I think you really hit on it there. It's how do you, given the vast array of tools at your disposal within the aircraft, ranging, like you said, from the Mark I eyeball all the way through the various sensors and weapons, and how do you actually build a situational awareness? And I'm sure everyone's a little bit different, but we can certainly share what we do, and I'm sure even you and I have differences in how we do things. There probably is no one right way, although I'm sure there are experts out there that will tell us how it's taught and things like that. But, from a BMS perspective, let's give it a shot.
Right. Yeah, totally. And, I know I, for one, am always happy to learn more about this. In fact, I was talking to you, and, not to dive into this right now, but I was talking to you earlier, and I'm like, yeah, it was interesting on that flight. I found myself using, TWIS, Track Well Search TWS mode, more for whatever bizarre reason on that flight than I normally do. Normally I tend to stick in RWS range well search mode, and I was like, well, that's weird. Why am I doing that differently? And obviously it has advantages and disadvantages. But anyway, sure. So it's like you say, that's only to just to kind of emphasize the point you made, which is that there are a million ways to do it, and always more to learn from people that do it differently from you.
We'd love to hear back, whether it's through comments on the podcast or hop on over to our website. Love to have some of those discussions, or better yet, come join us and show us how you do it.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I always post, right. So like you said, we have, comments available. We're putting the podcast on YouTube. People can put comments there if they like. I always post the podcast on the BMS forum. I post it on our website as well. Both of those forums are a great place to leave comments relevant to, the topic that we talked about. So, any of those places, obviously, we have a preference for our home turf. www.440thvfw.com is an excellent place to come and talk about this. But, let's lay down some things for people to agree, disagree, or otherwise comment on first.
Absolutely.
So I thought I'd kind of set the scene, which is, we've taken off, we are ingressing, we haven't maybe crossed the flot yet, but we've gotten up, we've done our ops check, we're established in formation. Let's say you're the flight lead and you're like, hey, all right, now we kind of got our game face on and we're pointed towards the bad guys. Or maybe, right? We don't actually know at this point whether there are any bad guys out there. We don't know the situation. And so for me, at least, the primary place I'm going to be looking, because it gives me the longest look, is the radar. But, I guess that's not actually true, right? Because there's AWACS as well, which gives me an even longer look. But I guess what I'm asking is, take me into that story, right? Like I'm
Sure.
here, I'm up, I'm looking to start to understand what the battlefield looks like.
Yeah, and I think you kind of hit on it there. That for me, as I start building my situational awareness, I mean, obviously you've done any recons, you've done all of that stuff in your pre-flight briefing, and you've tried to get an understanding of what's potentially in the battlefield. But like you say, now we're up in the air and you have to start building the actual situational awareness. And for me, it starts with that check-in, typically about 50 miles away from the airbase. We've left essentially friendly territory, or at least the traffic around the airbase, and we're shifting more into combat mode. And it's that check-in with AWACS to get that first high level, hey, is there anything that I need to be focused on right now? Or do I have some time to think about it? Or maybe there's nothing even in the area. So that's the first sweep for me, is to just get that 100,000 foot view, or whatever altitude they're flying at, probably about a 35,000 foot view, right?
Right. And so when we do that, I mean, I've noticed that the guys we fly with will do a different combination of requesting picture and requesting vector to threat. And I'm not sure all of our listeners are familiar with the difference between those two things, or that there's even two different things available. Yeah,
and I guess it depends for me. Typically I'll just go with a picture. However, if the picture has some unknown bandits that are hostile, I may ask for a vector to threat to find out if they truly are a threat, or is it just a hostile, bomber, cargo, transport, whatever. But the other reason I sometimes I'll issue them in combination is if I don't have necessarily a trust in what the AWACS is telling me. Sometimes the BMS AWACS does miss some things, or it seems to miss them, or we don't hear them, or whatever it is. And I know these are things that the dev team continues to work on, and they're doing a phenomenal job on that. But sometimes I will issue both those commands just to, again, get that quick picture, kind of a double check. Picture may be clear, but then why am I getting spiked by an aircraft, or why do I see something on my RWR? And one command or the other may seem to illuminate what that is.
Right. And just for people that don't know, the difference is with the picture you're getting all enemy aircraft, and with vector to threat you're getting just fighter aircraft that could be a threat to you, like a Su-25 isn't really or an IL, like a bomber isn't really a threat to you. Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Okay.
So that's where I start. And then a lot of it depends on the mission, and I think we're going to hear a lot of it depends in this conversation.
Of course.
So it depends on what my role within the package and within the mission is. If I'm a strike flight lead, I may keep the formation relatively tight, something like a loose route or an arrowhead or something like that. If I'm in my role is more escort or bar cap or a tar cap or something like that, I may spread the formation out. If I've got a full 4-ship flight, may just be a big spread if I'm going into, and I want to just sweep up, into enemy territory that way. Maybe it's a fighting wing or something like that that gives us a little bit more maneuverability and support of individual elements. And then I'll try to, again, divvy up some of the responsibilities. There's, again, depends on where you are and what you're flying over. Sometimes you may may need to be looking down. You've got potential enemy threats launching off of an airbase that you're going to be flying relatively close, and so you need to have either a radar or a pair of eyes or both scanning down and close, right? Whereas somebody else should be scanning, out there at 80 miles and maximizing what they're doing. Maybe somebody is tasked with burning through any jamming contacts. As flight lead, that's typically what I'll try to focus on, any of the unknowns, and see if I can get them to light up. But then once hostiles are detected and threats are detected, that's where I know, again, as a flight lead, I like to start divvying up responsibilities and potentially handing off targets to different flight elements or different pilots within the flight. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that too.
Yeah, so you actually mentioned something that reminded me of a lesson that we learned the hard way. You mentioned that it makes sense to sometimes at least divvy up the responsibilities and say, hey, yep, number 3, you're looking down. We found out the hard way on at least one mission, and I think this might have been in the campaign we did in the Korea 1989 theater, which is a fantastic theater, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Where we discovered that we needed to start taking escort flights, which is something that, for whatever reason, we hadn't been doing enough of, and so we started emphasizing that in that campaign, and it worked out well. But one of the flights we did, we managed to park the escort flight more or less right on top of an enemy airbase where we should have known, where the intel
yep,
was available at enemy flights. And these enemy flights were taking off underneath us, and you could not actually, because of where we'd set up the orbits, you couldn't actually depress the radar far enough to see them. And so I think that points out that it's smart to consider, as you said, where the enemy threats are coming from, and think about being able to detect flights that are taking off, which includes maybe offsetting or setting back or whatever, orienting yourself to the target such that you can see all the way down to the ground with
right,
whatever sensors you're using.
And again, throwing in another depends, it could be weather that influences some of this as well. If you've got beautiful clear skies, you may not have to offset very much, just far enough that you can look out your canopy and keep an eyeball on the runway and on the ramp of the enemy airbase. If it's poor weather, yeah, you're going to need to back off a little bit so that you can get somebody get the right angle so that the radar can give you the warning that you need and the time that you need as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great job for a number 2 or a number 4, by the way, visually scanning. I mean, that should be part of it. Any wingman's responsibility is to do the scan of your lead or your number 3's 6. And so if you're assigning responsibilities, having number 4 be primary on the radar probably doesn't make a lot of sense. Having them say, hey, you should always be looking at this enemy airbase that's 10 miles off our nose with your eyeballs, with the TGP, whatever. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Absolutely. Yep.
Although, as you say, it depends.
Right.
Right. So here we are. We're ingressing. We've called AWACS. We've gotten picture.
Starting to build that that situational awareness. Yep.
That's right. So here we are. We've gotten a hit. The radar is painting a target. It's in the direction of enemy forces. It's to the north, say, in Korea. And it's about 70 miles out. It's, sort of vaguely hot, right? Like it's pointed generally in our direction. It's moving at a decent clip, so it's not a helicopter or something. We can see that on the radar. What are we doing next? What's our strategy for assessing that thing?
Yeah, again, it goes back to what's your particular role. If and where are you within the package? If you're out on the edge, either flying an escort or seed or something like that, where you're up front and you need to assess that threat, there's a couple ways you can do it. If certainly those that I like to use are if part of my role is escort and defense of the package, then clearly I'm going to be taking the lead and reaching out. I may split the flight up or the element up and have one pilot race out a little bit further, try and get burn through on the target, get a positive ID, maybe even get a shot off, depending on the situation. And obviously this depends on, are there surface to air threats you have to consider, and is the target that you're after, protected on some air defense envelope or whatever. But assuming you've got the ability, it's try and create some spacing within your flight so that you can protect each other, get somebody out in front. And this is where part of my sensor management is looking at the HSD. For this kind of flight, I would, or this kind of engagement, I'd probably keep the HSD in the depressed mode so that I'm looking mostly forward, and I'd be watching my flight element maybe get a 10-mile lead on me or something like that. If I'm out in the lead, maybe I'll switch the HSD into centered mode so I can keep an eye on where my support is. And of course, this is assuming I've got good data link, good dolly. But then, when you get that person that's out front, and they've identified it as a true threat, if they can take a shot, that's great. And this may be where range wall scan or track wall scan also comes into play. If I'm a single ship that's pushed ahead and I realize it's a two ship, hey, I can flip into Twiz mode, get two shots off really quick, even if they're really hot, and potentially then even snip the missiles early and run back to the safety of the rest of the flight, kind of dragging the enemies back into the hopefully waiting jaws of the rest of the flight,
right?
So that they can pounce on them. And so for me, it's the tools I'm using for that are obviously the FCR, the TGP to potentially get at eyes on the target a little earlier if AWACS is unable to tell me what that hostile is. But then also the HSD to kind of give me that bird's eye view of what's going on, and if I need to snip early or whatever, what's my vector back to safety? Am I turning left or right to get back to that safety of the rest of the flight as quick as possible?
Yeah, so much good stuff in there. I mean, I'm just trying to, I want to kind of revisit a few of those things. So,
sure.
So first of all, I think you mentioned something that is pretty obvious when you think about it, but it's one of those things that when things get really hot and active can be difficult to actually do, which is to maintain proper spacing. So let's imagine we're a 4-ship, and let's say I'm number 3 and you're number 1. And you've said, hey, element, you guys are gonna stay back. And so we're gonna go up, there's a 4-ship inbound. We've identified them as hostile. I'm gonna go up and me and my number 2 are gonna launch missiles, and then we're gonna turn on and drag back towards you. So for me, as an element lead, what I would be looking for there is to stay somewhere, and it depends on the situation, like you said, but somewhere in the 10 to 20 mile, spacing range, just because I think that winds up being a really good amount of time, right? Like you can get back under my missile coverage quickly enough. Right. I can take shots on your attackers, before they've had a chance to sneak up behind you, or not sneak up behind you, but like race up behind you. And so that's actually a little bit challenging, right, to keep that, because you kind of have to be thinking about, I mean, one of the big things that we see all the time is people get buck fever, right? They're like, I'm not going to turn around even though I know I should, but like to have the discipline to say, okay, I'm now, 15 miles in advance of my element. They're still turning around. I really ought to hook turn right now rather than wait 5 more miles, which is not much time.
That's a really good point, and that's one of the things that we really drive into people here at the 440th is, again, this is not about getting huge kill counts.
Right.
This is a team effort, and this is where we're looking to really leverage the tactics that we know are going to work. And get yourself out there. Maybe you can get a Fox 3 long shot on it and snip early. And again, if your job was simply to scare the bad guys off and be an escort or a cap to let somebody come in, that might be enough. But if you're out there on a sweep or something, or you feel that this is a big enough threat that they've got to be destroyed, you may not want them to run off, because all you've done is postpone the inevitable. You may want to act as that bait, do the hook turn, split S, whatever, bring it back, and drag those enemies back in. That's just as important a role.
Yeah, you mentioned split S, which I think is a good thing to bring up, because if you're doing that thing where you're coming up with the second element, and the first element has either shot or not shot, but they're egressing, but they're still in front of you. They're, you're number one, and you're number two as well. You're flying back towards me, and I'm outbound. I really don't want to be shooting an AIM-120 into your face, because anything goes wrong. We have seen this. They will. In fact,
absolutely.
Didn't we have a casualty in a mission a few weeks ago where it wasn't luckily one of the human pilots, but we actually had an AI snip a missile and down a friendly, like a friendly AI downed a friendly human pilot.
Yes. Yep.
So, you mentioned split S, right? Like, that's actually a really, I think, useful technique that we've used, where when the lead element is disengaging, not only are they trading altitude for speed to be able to egress faster, but you now suddenly go from, say, Angels 27 to maybe Angels, 20 or whatever it is, and now you're below the plane where if I'm lofting a missile into the guys behind you,
exactly.
you're not going to get...
It creates some separation
exactly.
Vertically. It also helps, it can help the tail end portion of the flight that's covering you, distinguish who's who much quicker, right?
Yeah.
They may not, especially if they're not part of your flight, but maybe just part of your package, or better yet, maybe even a different package. They may not have you on data link.
Right. Or you just turned hot and you all you've got is like 40 dots on your scope, and you're like, okay, well, I know one of those is my guys and one of them isn't.
And so, yeah, absolutely. Doing the split S or slicing turn away, and calling out, to those that you're coming back to that are covering you. I've got missile in the air, snipped it, and I'm egressing, coming out at Angels 20 or whatever it is, to let them know that, that's you. And maybe if you're good, also say, I'm coming out at Angels 20, Bandits last seen, Angels 25, right? So it helps to narrow that down.
Totally.
Yep.
Totally. Yeah. Those are all good. I'm trying to think. There was other good stuff in what you were talking about. You mentioned a couple things. You mentioned using the HSD in either depressed or centered mode.
Yeah,
and there's also coupled versus decoupled, which I think is also really interesting.
True.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that for people that might not ever use those features.
Well, I'll start with the centered and depressed mode. I tend to use that more than anything else on the HSD. For me, it gets back to where am I trying to build that situational awareness? If I'm, focusing outbound, then it is probably more in that depressed mode where you've got that essentially forward-facing view, and this is great especially if I'm coming up to help another flight. I get, and if I've got them on data link, I can start seeing what they're seeing, and it gives me that mostly forward-focused view. And for me, that's pretty much the default setting, and that's where I want to be. But when I get on station, or if I'm trying to hold a particular portion of airspace, or if I'm better yet, if I'm getting into a furball, I may quickly flip that into a centered mode and maybe even zoom in. Instead of looking 80 miles out, I want more detail. I may pull that back to 40 or even 20 miles in centered mode, so that I can get a better sense of what's going on around me. Where are my friendlies? Where are my enemies? Where are the threats that I've got to be focused on? And really just protect that bubble of airspace around my aircraft or my flight. So for me, it definitely changes depending on the type of flight I'm doing and what phase of that flight that I happen to be in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, for me, this is something that I feel like I feel like it's sort of a progression, right? Like you start out being able to operate the radar, and maybe you flip between RWS and TWS or whatever, and then that management of the HSD, oddly enough, seems to be, at least for me, it was a more like a later thing, right? Like it's a thing that I came to later. So I feel like it's the kind of thing that people may not be doing as much, flipping between
Sure.
centered and depressed mode, where your aircraft appears either in the center of the scope or, you know, farther down more to more match the radar. So it's really useful though, like you say, being able to get more information on the HSD of what's behind you is super useful, both in the air-to-air mode when you're not pointed at the target, but also air-to-ground, which we haven't even talked about yet. I think that might actually be a whole separate topic. It's
Yeah,
how
I
to
think
use
you're right.
sensors usage in air-to-ground. But anyway, so yeah, it's good stuff. Good stuff. Something I wanted to ask you about too, we mentioned this a couple times, is RWS versus Twiz. Twiz, for whatever reason, my personal style is not to use it very much. I just find that I'll use RWS in bug targets. I guess one of the things I like is the quickness of it. But lately I've found myself moving back and forth between Twiz and RWS a little bit more. I wonder if maybe you could describe to me what your radar usage would look like to the extent that there is one, typical engagement when you're looking to switch between modes like that.
Yeah, for me, again, I will fly mostly RWS for those same reasons. You get, I believe, slightly better range, a quicker response on things. The Twiz, let me back up. I'll start an engagement certainly in RWS as we're trying to acquire targets and figure out what's really there. I'll also make heavy usage of the expand feature within the FCR, right? To zoom in and see, are we looking at a singleton, a 2-ship, or is it a 4-ship? To try and get as much information as early as possible, to try and stay ahead of the curve and figure out what's going to potentially happen next. If I'm in essentially what will come out to be a one-on-one engagement, so maybe it's myself and a wingman taking on what may look like a single contact, but ultimately turns out to be 2 contacts, I stay in RWS. I find it just easier to manage. Mm-hmm. However, the moment the ratio starts to shift, I will find myself in Twiz mode almost certainly, because I'm going to be more than likely taking on multiple shots. And so anytime I'm even thinking about taking multiple shots, I'll engage Twiz simply so that I've got the targets bugged up, and then it's just a matter of cycling through really quick to the ones that I've been designated or tasked to take on.
So now RWS does have limited capability to have multiple bug targets, right? You have the 2-target, I forget what the acronym for it is, but there's like a 2-target track capability in RWS. Yep. But you still find yourself moving to Twiz for that.
I do, especially if I'm if I really think I'm going to be engaging multiple targets. I'll bring that up because it's going to start sorting those targets for me. And it will start identifying, I forget exactly the criteria that it uses, but typically it's identifying the highest threats, at least I find, and I'm able to cycle through things really quickly, and I'll have them bugged up, and I can just essentially pickle off whatever is needed, and get that engagement going, and then immediately start cranking away from the targets, and or if needed, even snipping early and bugging out.
Right. No, that's a really good point about the prioritization algorithms. I think that is, one of the things I think that I found, and I think people will agree with this, is, when this stuff happens, it happens wicked fast, like at the limit of what seems like at least my ability to process events,
sure.
even when I'm in practice. So yeah, any fractions of a moment that you can save, not having to slew the cursor or whatever, are super useful.
Exactly. Yep.
So I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about how you fuse the TGP in this. We typically carry a TGP. I've found myself over the years using it more and more in air-to-air engagements. Obviously, it's limited in air-to-air engagements. With respect to range, you're subject to visibility, which can often be under 20 miles, so that can make it difficult to use. But when and how do you find yourself using the TGP in air-to-air engagements?
The quick answer to when is as often as possible. And from I guess from an engagement perspective, it certainly helps confirm, especially if AWACS is only giving you, a hostile but not truly identifying information. I want to know how hostile, because I believe it will call an a MiG-19 a hostile just as easily as it'll call a Su-30.
Right.
And there's a big difference, right?
Yeah.
So,
right. And MiG-19 at 7,000 feet is like, well, that's cute.
Never mind. Yeah. Good luck with that. So trying to identify that target visually, I think, really helps. It helps a little bit at night as well, I think, because it's harder to pick things up, with an eyeball, especially at long distances. So getting that, and I think it lets you see some of the detail of what's going on. I mean, you're seeing real time that, hey, he has just put himself up on knife edge. That means he's going to be turning hard any second here, and I know which way he's going. I'm not waiting for a radar return and a track to start developing, right? So for me, that's how I use it. And the other thing I'll do is sometimes I'll get them locked up, do a soft lock on the FCR, bring it up in the TGP, and hard lock them on the TGP and drop the FCR altogether.
Right.
So it gives you a little bit of a stealthness. You can sneak up a little bit closer.
Oh, and track him when he's behind you when you turn cold.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's on the
right. Yeah.
It's on the JMCS as well.
Right.
Yeah, totally.
Well, lots of advantages there, I think. Obviously, there's limitations. I mean, it's depending on what kind of visibility is going on. The weather plays a huge factor. Is the aircraft below an overcast or above an overcast? I mean, so there's definitely limitations. But when able, I find it's a really useful tool, and I think it does give you, again, going back to that extra split second to look at something and give you a little head start on what the bandit's going to be doing next.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. That's good stuff. So, we started this out talking about developing a picture, and obviously that means using all the sensors available to you. We've talked about the HSD, which includes data link, obviously. We've talked about the radar. We've talked about the TGP. I guess the other one I can think of, and I'm sure I'm forgetting something, the thing is bristling with sensors, is the RWR. Is that something that you find yourself using much of, and if so, how?
Yeah, the RWR is something I feel I use, and I want to come back to one quick thing on the HSD. You said it. Obviously, that includes the data link. I think there's an important thing that people may or may not be aware of with that data link feature, and there is a difference between what kind of information you get depending on where you or how you configure those flights within the HSD itself or the data link itself, right? There's the left column and right column, and it's not just because the screen is short, right? There's a difference between putting a data link number into the left column and right column, and that is anything in the left column, you will also be able to share automatically their air-to-air contacts. So if you're in slot 1 and I'm in slot 2 and we've got another flight in slot 3 and 4 on the left-hand side, and someone from that other flight bugs an aircraft, I will see that show up on my HSD as well as that person. So it helps increase that situational awareness and seeing all that detail. But if I have them on the right side, I'm not sharing those air-to-air contacts. So it's important to think about that as you're setting up the data link. And obviously, if you've got a 4-ship, you're more than likely going to fill the whole left-hand side with your flight because that's what's most important to you. But if you've got an extra slot or two on the left-hand side, it might be good. Let's say you're a strike flight, and you know you've got a 2-ship escort. Hey, throw the escort on the left-hand side because you're going to get a heads up as to what are they tracking, are they doing their job, or has something slipped through potentially. You're going to be able to see that much better than if they were just over on the right-hand side.
Totally. Yeah, one common thing that we've done a lot is, and we briefed this during our pre-brief that we talked about on the prior episode, where maybe we have like a 2-ship seed, 2-ship escort, and maybe a 4-ship strike. And so if you and I were in the escort, we might do one of two things. We might set up, you and me in numbers 1 and 2 on the left. And then we might either put the 2-ship seed on the left side as well, so we can see both of what both of those aircraft are doing in terms of air-to-air lock. Because it's pretty typical for a seed escort to go in, shoot their harms, and then revert to
take on escort.
Exactly. Yeah. Or sometimes what we'll do is we will put the two of us in the first 2 slots on the left, and then put the lead flights from the seed and the strike flights. So we would be like, let's say you and I are flight 1, would be 1-1, 1-2, and then maybe 2-1 and 3-1 on the left, just to give us some indication of what's going on with all the flights in the package.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah.
And
totally.
then fill the others in, as much as you can on the right hand side. But yeah.
Right.
So thinking about that is an important part of that pre-flight planning. And I don't know about you, but I've even switched things around during flight, depending on how things are shaking out, especially if you've lost some aircraft or roles are changing. Don't be afraid to change those things.
I'm laughing because I did
the battle is dynamic.
I did that exactly this last week when my flight lead, Zeus, got shot, or not shot down, but shot up early in the flight. So I had to rearrange some things on data link.
Yes, I'm sure you did. You had your hands full that flight.
Yeah, well, luckily I had flak magnet in front of me, so that helped a lot. Story for another time. That's good stuff. No, thank you for mentioning that too, because you know what? That actually reminds me of something else too, which is the assign feature. Right, as long as we're talking about the data link. Something that I very rarely use, even when I was leading a lot. So I know it's something that you used effectively. Maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Sure. Again, that's a quick way for me, especially if I'm flight lead and I'm trying to dole out assignments. This comes in particularly handy if you've got kind of a high volume of comms going on, and you're trying to sneak something in. Not everything has to be said out loud over the radio, and that's a whole different topic. But if there's something going on, I may just save time and bug a target, hit the assign 3 button, and pass that over to my element lead, and hopefully he's paying attention and will get that and understands that, hey, I want him to check that out. Or I'm assigning him that target. Let's say we had already committed in the general direction of incoming flights. I can give him the heads up that this is what I want him to go engage and take on, and I may then move on to other targets. It's not like I'm using it to micromanage a flight and, okay, number 2, you take this one, number 3, you take this one, number 4, but rather just kind of a general, hey, here's what I want you to go look at. From there, let the flight lead or the element leads sort it out.
Totally. It reminds me of a little bit of a funny story. You know what? I'll tell that some other time. I'll tell it some other time. Anyway.
Oh, you tease.
No, it's just anyway, some other time. Cool. So data link's good stuff. The thing that got us, that we had detoured from, was to talk maybe a little bit about the RWR and how the utility of that.
So for me, RWS, couple of ways I use it. Again, it's that great 360 view of what's going on. So, it probably use it more. Well, I initially use it to see what's coming up and see what I'm flying into, right? Get an idea of where those threats are. Is it outer ring, inner ring? What the threats are. I mean, obviously that does a good job of telling you what's coming up, what specific threats they are. But then as the fight evolves, I find I use it more and more for, I don't want to say necessarily defensive things. I mean, clearly that helps when you're defending incoming missiles. or something like that. But sort of as a defensive measure, to just make sure that, hey, is my 6 really clear? Or is there still potentially something back there? Did those missile shots that I took and had to crank away from, find their targets, or is there potentially somebody that evaded my missile or slipped through, that's now tracking me down? And do I need to be, reaching out for assistance from somebody else in the flight? It's the poor man's version of an FCR looking backwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
It at least gives you a little bit of a picture of what's there, and is that thing a big threat or not?
Right. Yeah, it is secondary, I think it's fair to say, right? Like
absolutely.
You're referring to it to enhance your understanding.
Certainly as the engagement has progressed, it becomes secondary, right? Initially it might be a primary feature as you're starting to pick up, especially if you're on seed duty or something like that. It's really starting to alert you to things at long range. For me, it devolves into a secondary system for the most part once the battle has started.
Right. I think for me, another thing that it's useful as is actually around friendlies. This is something you see a lot, is you'll be looking north and there's a lot of aircraft, but there's a lot of friendlies, and so you can get a real quick notion of, there's a cluster of F-16s, maybe or F-15s to the northwest, and to the northeast, that's the 23s. Okay, that helps me orient on where the threats actually are.
Right, or if, like you said, you've got this bunch of targets, these contacts on the radar, and you know that somewhere over there, AWACS has told you that there's 4 ship MiG-29s. Hey, really need to pay attention to that. But on the other hand, if you're also seeing a bunch of F-18 and F-16 symbols lighting up in that same direction, maybe I don't have to focus on all that. Right?
Might be handled, especially if you've got your hands full with striker responsibilities.
Right. There could be other more pressing targets in a different direction that you can then focus on.
Yeah, like that MiG-19 at 7,000 feet, right? That's a serious
sneaking
threat.
Up behind you.
Yeah.
Yep. He's finally made it up to 12,000 feet.
Right. Well, cool. Well, dude, this is all good stuff. I mean, and I think it was a torrent of good information. I know when I was getting started, this was stuff that I would have loved to have heard, and it would have taken me quite a while to absorb. I know we haven't even touched on air to ground.
Right.
We haven't touched on any of the closer and stuff, like the dogfight stuff, but I don't know. I feel like that's a pretty good sort of.
Hopefully it's it's like you said. Hopefully this gives some people some ideas on what the capabilities of the aircraft are, where at least you and I use how we use these sensors, and there's a lot of them. As we said at the beginning, I mean, neither one of us do this for a living,
right?
And so we'd love to hear from you how others do it. I'm sure there's experts out there that may or may not be able to confirm this is how it's really done.
Can neither confirm nor deny.
Right.
Yes.
Again, not to make too blatant a plug, but love to have you come over and join us, even if it's for one of our pickup flights. Come fly with us. Obviously, love to have you. If you want to come actually join the wing, love to have you. We're certainly recruiting more pilots. The more the merrier. That allows us to design more exciting missions, larger missions, more complex things.
More often. Yep.
More often. Yep. Even just pop in for a little bit, share your ways of doing things, whether it's just dropping in and leaving a note on the forums, or if it's coming along for a flight and sharing some of what you do through a more hands-on experience and giving us some pointers in briefing or debriefing mode. So
totally.
Always looking to learn more.
Yeah, and I think I might mention too, I believe it may have been since the last podcast we shipped our new ATO air tasking order, which is our scheduling tool.
Definitely. Let's touch on that. Yeah.
So this is open to, in other words, anyone that comes to the website can see this. You can look in the sort of the top left corner of the website and you'll see ATO air tasking order. If you click on that, it'll show you a calendar or a list view, your choice. And then I think the important thing is that if you click on one of the flights that we have scheduled, and it'll show you all the flights that we have scheduled, it'll say on that page that shows for that mission that we have created, who the flight is open to, and some of those flights are open to the phrase that we use is all registered users. And that just means basically anybody that's signed up on our website that is welcome to fly that flight. So, you come in, you click, as I think I was saying earlier, you got to click like 3 times and then you're signed up. Obviously it's probably not a bad idea to reach out and say, hey, I want to fly this flight. I see you open it up to everybody. Is there anything I need to know? And we'd be happy to explain what the what the things that you might not know ahead of time, are like server addresses or TeamSpeak information or whatever it is. Some of our simplified standard operating procedures type of thing. But that is something for people to keep an eye out for, is to look for those flights that are open to all registered users.
Absolutely. Yep. Love to have you stop by. Always room for someone else to join.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, cool. Yeah, man, you got anything else for tonight, or should we come back and talk more some other time?
I think this has probably been a good start. Love to get some feedback. Like I say, we can do follow-up topics. And, of course, again, just thank everybody for tuning in, and hope to see you in the air.
Likewise, yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again, Zeus, and thanks, like he said, to everyone for listening. This has been the 440th VFW podcast.